Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some students seem to always do better than others? And if it's just about individual smarts, or something more complicated? Well, this new study dives deep into that very question, looking at how different parts of a student's identity can all add up to create really different educational experiences. In a nutshell, these researchers wanted to figure out if simple differences in things like gender, how much money a family has, or if a student's parents are from another country are enough to explain why some kids do better in school than others? Or is it more about how all those things together create unique challenges or advantages for certain groups of students? They looked at over 500,000 students from 8 different countries over 20 years, which is a massive amount of data. You see, we know that students from different backgrounds don't always get the same educational outcomes. For a long time, we've talked about things like socioeconomic status, how much money your family has, or just gender and how they affect school. But the researchers here are interested in where these things overlap. Think about a girl whose parents didn't go to college and who also has an immigrant background. Her experience might be very different from a boy whose parents are both doctors and who grew up in the same country his whole life. It's the combination of these factors, the intersection, that they wanted to understand. They call this intersectional educational inequality. It is a fancy way of saying that when you look at how different social groups are treated, you can't just add up the effects of each group one by one. Sometimes you get something completely different, either better or worse, when those identities combine. The big problem the researchers saw was that, while people talked about this a lot, there wasn't much hard, big picture data to show how widespread these intersectional inequalities were, and if they were changing over time across different countries. So, how did they investigate this huge question? They used a really clever statistical method called MAIDHA, which is like a sophisticated way of analyzing data where people belong to multiple groups at once. Think of it as a way to account for all the different hats a student wears, like student, boy or girl, daughter or son of immigrants, and so on. They then applied this method to data from the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, which tests 15-year-olds in math, reading, and science. They looked at data from the years 2000, all the way up to 2022, from countries like Australia, Brazil, Finland, Germany, Hong Kong, Italy, Israel, and the United States. They ended up defining 40 different groups based on combinations of gender, socioeconomic status, which they measured by parents' jobs and education level, and whether a student had an immigrant background. So imagine a student could be a girl from a family with low parental education and have an immigrant background. That is one of the many specific cells they filled in their massive data spreadsheet. Now for the findings, the first big question was, how much do these different intersectional groups actually matter in terms of achievement? They found that these groups explained a pretty significant chunk of the differences in student scores, sometimes up to 30% in reading. That is a big deal, and it is comparable to how much differences between schools can explain achievement gaps. But then they asked an even more crucial question: if we already know a student's gender, their family's socioeconomic status, and if they have an immigrant background, how much extra difference in achievement is explained by the specific combination of those factors? This is where it gets really interesting. In most countries, this extra bit, the intersection-specific part, was quite small. This meant that a lot of the inequality they saw could be explained by just adding up the effects of each individual category. So for example, if you know a student is from a lower socioeconomic background and you know they are a girl, you might already capture most of the achievement gap for that student without needing to look at the specific intersection of being a lower sex girl. However, there were exceptions. Brazil, for instance, consistently showed higher intersection, specific inequalities compared to most other countries. This means that in Brazil, the specific combination of gender, CS, and immigrant background really did matter more, beyond just the individual effects of each factor. They also found that in Israel, the inequalities became even more structured by these social categories over time. Let's talk about what this actually looks like for students. They were able to predict the average achievement for each of those 40 intersectional groups. Across almost all countries and subjects, they found a pretty consistent pattern for the lowest performers. These were typically boys from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Whether they had an immigrant background or not varied by country, but the low sex and male gender were common threads. On the flip side, the highest performing groups were usually girls from high socioeconomic backgrounds, again with immigrant background varying by country. What's striking about these results is how big the gaps could be. In some countries, the difference in predicted scores between the highest and lowest performing intersectional groups was huge. equivalent to over 2 standard deviations on the PISA scale. Imagine the difference between being able to do only the most basic reading tasks and being able to critically evaluate complex texts. That is the kind of gap we're talking about. But the study didn't stop there. They also looked for groups that performed surprisingly well or surprisingly poorly, even after you accounted for their gender, CS, and immigrant background. They found some interesting outliers. For example, in Israel, boys from less educated families who were in lower status jobs performed worse than expected. This suggests that sometimes when a family's social status indicators don't quite match up, like having more education but a lower paying job, it can be a disadvantage. On the other hand, they found some persistent advantages for specific groups. For instance, in Brazil, Israel, and Italy, boys from very high SES families with highly educated parents consistently outperformed expectations. This highlights how, even in advantage situations, specific combinations of factors can lead to even greater success. So, what does all of this mean? The core takeaway is that while individual social categories like gender, SES, and immigrant status are important, their intersections can create unique patterns of educational inequality. In most countries, the disparities were largely driven by the additive effects of these categories, meaning you could predict a lot of the outcome just by looking at each factor separately. However, the intersection-specific effects, while often smaller, were still there and remarkably stable over time. The researchers emphasized that these findings are system-specific, meaning what happens in Brazil might be different from what happens in Germany. The sheer size of the achievement gaps between the highest and lowest performing intersectional groups is a critical finding. It means that for some students, the educational system is not working as effectively as it does for others, and these differences are deeply tied to their social identities. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. While they looked at 8 countries, it is not every country in the world, and they noted that European countries were a bit overrepresented. Also, the way they defined immigrant background or socioeconomic status might not capture every nuance of every culture. They also mentioned that they couldn't find significant differences in inequality proportions before and after the COVID-19 pandemic, which might mean that while there were learning losses, the structural inequalities at the intersectional level didn't change dramatically in that short period. This research is incredibly valuable because it moves beyond simply looking at single factors and really embraces the complexity of how multiple social identities shape educational journeys. The MAIDHA method they used is a powerful tool for unpacking these intricate relationships. It's a clear call to action for policymakers and educators when we design interventions or try to close achievement gaps. We can't just fix one thing. We need to think about how different groups of students experience school based on the unique combination of their identities. For instance, a program designed to help low SES students might need to be tailored differently for boys versus girls, or for students with and without immigrant backgrounds, depending on the country's context. Future research could dive deeper into the specific mechanisms behind these intersectional effects. Why do certain combinations lead to advantages or disadvantages? Are there specific school practices, cultural norms, or family resources that play a role? Understanding these nuances can help create more targeted and effective solutions.